a question we've had already from Sanjita Bhattacharya, who says, is it okay to ask for the context of words when a student asks you to explain a meaning? Because often as a teacher, I myself can't give the dictionary meaning right away unless I read the context.
Well, let me answer that question in two ways. Of course, knowing a word in context is very important. That is your goal. It's pointless just to know words out of context. So wherever possible, present a context for the word. But having said that, let me also point out how important it is to learn the first 1,000 or 1,500 words as rapidly as possible. Because if you don't have that first 1,500 most common, most frequent words, you won't be able to understand the context around new words that you're learning. So it's a little bit of a paradox here that yes, we want to learn a language in context, we want to learn vocabulary in context, but to understand contexts, we need to know the most basic, most frequent words that establish those contexts. So the best advice I would give you is learn the first couple of 1,000 words as quickly as you can, using whatever method you can, which is fastest for your students. Even if it is a translation list, it doesn't matter. Just get those first couple of 1,000 words established. After that, learning vocabulary is much easier because you will always be able to understand most of the context in which a new word pops up.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. I should mention one particular reason we're extremely pleased to have Professor McCarthy with us is because in addition to his many professorships at the University of Nottingham, University of Limerick, Newcastle, and his many books, particularly for Cambridge University Press, but particularly the Touchstone course, Mike is also part of the English Profile team and has been involved in the development of English Profile since 2008. Okay, so moving on to a second question from Shane Jordan. My learners struggle to use a wide range of vocabulary in what they say. They don't read extensively due to time constraints in college. What other alternatives are there to get them learning words apart from just teaching them word families and using a thesaurus?
Well, nowadays, a lot of students are not natural readers. Most of us, even people who are of the older generation like myself, spend a lot of time on the internet reading web pages rather than reading long books. But we shouldn't forget that you can also learn a lot of vocabulary just by listening. And everybody enjoys listening. Listening to films, listening to pop songs, listening to the thousands and hundreds of thousands of audio clips and video clips that are available on the internet. So don't underestimate the power of learning vocabulary receptively through listening, not just through reading. Mm-hmm. But I would once again say that vocabulary learning can be made much easier if you really have a drive to focus on the first couple of 1,000 most frequent words. Now, this is where the English vocabulary profile is very good because it is graded according to the appropriateness of the vocabulary for each level of the Common European Framework. So you can look at all of the A1 words or A2 vocabulary or B1 or B2 vocabulary. And the vocabulary which is labeled as A1 and A2, these are the words that you really must learn. And once you've learned those words, learning all the rest becomes easier. But if you don't learn those words, all of the words are difficult.
Okay, thanks. A question from Teresa Samuez Pereira, who asks, is it a good idea to have learners build a glossary around different issues?
Yes, it is a good idea, Teresa. And of course, this is exactly what we have on the English vocabulary profile. The English vocabulary profile, if you haven't had a look at it yet, please go to the website after this presentation, after this session. And you'll see there that it is not just a list of words, not just a list of words according to level. You can also look at particular topics. You can look at, holidays or money or food, and there you get vocabulary grouped according to those topics. And it's a good habit to get your own students to do that. Every student should have a vocabulary notebook. It could be a paper notebook, or it could be their smartphone or their tablet. But whatever it is very important to write down new vocabulary. And better than just writing down each word in a list as it comes up, it's a very good idea to have it organized according to topics or themes or ideas or particular interests of your own. So if that's what you mean, then I think that's an excellent idea. Absolutely excellent. And that's what Annette Cable, when she was researching and creating the English vocabulary profile, that was one of the things that she did.
Okay, thanks. Another question from Sanjita, who asks whether writing sentences using your new vocabulary is the only way to retain that vocabulary, or do you have suggestions for other ways that can be done as well?
I think there are many ways that can be done. Of course, writing sentences is very helpful, but most human beings can draw even very simple pictures. We're not all great artists, but everybody can draw a little picture or a little symbol to represent the meaning of something. So if horse is a new word, the animal, most people can do a little drawing that looks something like a horse. So encourage your learners to do whatever they think is going to help them most. It could be drawings. It could also be write down the new word and write down just another word you associate it with. So it could be something like, if you find the word, a new word like impatient. Do you know any people who are impatient? Is your mom or your dad or your brother or your sister, are they impatient? Just write down brother, sister, or best friend. And that will serve as a mnemonic, something to help you remember what that word means. A variety of ways of writing down vocabulary. If you learn a new adjective, is there an opposite word that will help you know what it means? So if you learn the word, you come across the word freezing, talking about the weather, well, yes, you could say, that means very cold. So I'll write down opposite of hot, opposite of very hot. In the course that Alistair kindly mentioned, which I am co-author of, Touchstone and the Advanced Level Viewpoint, which Cambridge published, every unit in all of the levels of that course have a vocabulary notebook where we give teachers and learners tips on different ways of recording vocabulary and many, many different ways of remembering and making notes to help you remember the new vocabulary, to help you organize it, to help you understand its meaning. Not just through writing sentences, many, many different ways. So have a look at Touchstone and Viewpoint, and have a look at the vocabulary notebooks, which are at the end of each unit. And you may find a lot of new ideas there. I hope you will anyway.
Okay, thank you. A question now from David Duran Ruiz, who asks, Since we put together lists about the vocabulary that students should know at a particular level, shouldn't we also put together lists of the vocabulary they actually know or feel confident using? Would that be helpful?
Well, let me explain how the English vocabulary profile actually works. In fact, it's two things. It is a way of saying, yes, these are the words which a B2 student should know or a C1 student should know. But these lists in the English vocabulary profile were actually based on what students do know. Everything in the English vocabulary profile is based on language which learners have used at that level, taken from the thousands of Cambridge examination papers over many years. So the purpose of the English vocabulary profile is to say, we have looked, or the researchers have looked at thousands of examples of students writing. And these are the words which a typical B1 student does use. These are the words which a typical B2 student does use. So the English vocabulary profile gives you two things. It tells you, yes, these are the words which students use. And at the same time, if your students are not using them, then this may be a way of saying, well, if I want my students to be typical B2 students, then this is a good list of words that perhaps they should know. So you can do both things. What they know, what typical students know, and what they should know.
Thanks. That leads into an interesting follow-up question from David, actually. He says, do you consider that as teachers, we've been successful in teaching, considering that our learners often don't actually know particularly the grammar and vocabulary that they're meant to know, or that we would expect them to know at each level?
Yeah, I think there's a long history to this, David. I don't know how long you've been in the English language teaching profession, but I personally started teaching in the 1960s, in 1966, which is a very long time ago, almost half a century ago. Now, when I began as a teacher, we taught almost exclusively grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation. That was all, really. That was everything we did. Then in the 1970s and 80s, the pendulum swung the other way, and we went to another extreme, which was an extreme form of the communicative way of teaching, where many teachers said, well, grammar doesn't matter, vocabulary doesn't matter, pronunciation doesn't matter. What matters is communicate. But of course, we realized that you can't communicate without grammar and vocabulary. And personally, my view is the most important of all the things for communication is vocabulary. That's why I'm here today. So in some ways, we need to get back to the roots, back to the basics of language teaching, which is the grammar and the vocabulary, but to do it in a way in which is communicative, which gives learners opportunities to communicate. What we did wrong when I started teaching was we just taught for grammar and vocabulary, presented it. Then we expected our learners just to use it. That's never enough. What I think is the ideal situation is lots of vocabulary, but lots of contexts and situations and opportunities to use it productively. But basically, I think I'm on your side. I believe that we don't pay enough attention to the actual matter, the subject matter of the language.
Okay, thanks. A question now from Abir, who says, I teach a pre-university English course, and our approach is to teach students vocabulary from the AWL. Some of the students do, however, struggle with basic vocabulary. Would you recommend teaching words based on their frequency or on the student's actual future needs?
I think in the case of the kind of preparatory course that you refer to, which I myself have taught on many occasions over the last 30 years, I'm familiar with the problem that you mentioned, that the academic word list, the AWL, as you said, is a very excellent list. It's a list of vocabulary that is common to many different academic disciplines, arts and scientific disciplines. But you refer to a problem that some students don't even have the most basic vocabulary. The academic word list alone is not enough. It represents a middle level of vocabulary. Up there at the top, you have all the highly specialized words of each different subject and discipline. In the middle, you have the academic word list, but there are still, as I mentioned earlier, maybe 1,500, even when you're writing 2,000 words, which are the common core, the fundamental foundations of the whole language. So if you're going to teach students who are going to go on to EAP or ESP courses, you must be sure, first of all, that they have that basic core vocabulary of a couple of thousand words. It's pointless to start looking at the academic word list or even more specialized vocabulary until you have got over that one obstacle. And I think a lot of universities make a mistake. They say to students, yes, come in, do a pre-sessional course, and then you'll be okay. The best advice they could give students is come in and we will give you general basic English for the first 3 or 4 weeks. Then we'll move on to the academic word list. Then when you become a student at this university, you will then be exposed to the specialized terminology of your chosen subject. I believe that very firmly and strongly based on my own experience as a director of English for academic purposes at the University of Nottingham back in the 1990s. It was a problem then, and it still is a problem now.
So provide them with a basic foundation before moving on.
Yes, don't run before you can walk. I know every student who wants to study abroad, it gets very excited about the idea of doing English for academic purposes, but you cannot do academic English until you have that foundation in general English, especially the vocabulary, the core vocabulary, the 1,500 or 2,000 most frequent words. I say 1,500 or 2,000 because it depends on whether your goal is speaking or writing. For everyday conversation, you can probably survive on about 1,500, but for writing, you need a couple of thousand. For some types of specialist writing, you may need 2,500 or 3,000 words, but focus on those first couple of thousand, and then you'll be ready to do the academic word list. And once you've done the academic word list, then you're ready to do other specialist lists.
Okay, thanks. Question about secondary school students now from Kama Islam, who says, my students always get confused by words that fall into more than one part of speech or words that have different meanings. How, as a teacher, can I facilitate their overcoming of those difficulties?
Yeah, well, let me say first of all that I only taught in secondary school for 2 semesters. So I'm not an expert on secondary school. And that was years ago when I was doing my teaching practice, when I was training to be a state school teacher in Great Britain. And I did my teaching practice in a secondary school, actually in the Netherlands, because I was a teacher of English as a second language. And I know the problem you're referring to. Now, one of the things that research shows, there's been some very interesting research on this, is that even when learners become quite high level, become quite advanced, one of their weakest points, a common weakness, is a lack of knowledge of the word classes that a word can belong to. You know, is this word a noun? Is it an adjective? Can I use it as a verb, etc.? This problem persists even at the highest levels. So I think it's a very good idea from the very, very beginning to encourage your students when they learn a new word, not only to write it down and its meaning or its translation, but always, always, always write the word class or classes that it can be used in. So if we take a simple word like book, you know, write it down. You may probably learn it first as a noun, so you write book, N for noun, but later you'll come across book as a verb. And then it's important to make a record of that as well. That's a very simple example, but it applies to absolutely everything. You learn the word believe, and you say, okay, that's a verb, but is it a noun? No, the noun is slightly different. The noun is belief, and the adjective is believable. And it's so important to get these word classes down in the first place. Because if you don't, then as you yourself said, your students will always be very confused because of all the different meanings. And what does book mean here? Is it something I read, or is it something I make a reservation for, etc.? So start right from the beginning, from day one, week one, day one, record the word classes of words, because research shows that that is going to be a long-term problem for learners.
Thanks. Question now from Geraldine Richmond. Some of my learners struggle to retain the new words they learn in a session. They're in-company learners who lack the time to study at home. So do you have any suggestions of techniques they can use in the classroom to help them learn and make use of the new words, perhaps particularly in speaking tasks?
Yeah, there are a number of tasks you can do to reinforce words. Obviously, one thing is to come back to them at later dates and revise them and test them again. That's the most obvious thing. But there are other ways of approaching this whole problem. And you mentioned speaking tasks, and I have spent many years studying spoken English. And one of the things that is very common in everyday speaking is that we actually repeat words that the other person has used. So if I meet someone in the street and they say, horrible weather today, isn't it? I can just say, yes, horrible. Or I could use a similar word like, yes, dreadful, yes, terrible. And practicing little games like this, where you have conversational pairs who have to give each other information of different kinds, and you say, okay, the rule of the game is when you reply, when you answer, you must use at least one word that the other person used. So you're getting double exposure, you're repeating words, and repetition is something that we do anyway when we speak. So that would be an example of reinforcing vocabulary in spoken language. Another little technique which I was discussing with someone yesterday who's a testing expert is to have a paragraph, a closed test, you know, where you have gaps and you have to fill in the missing word. But every gap is filled with a word that is somewhere else already in the text, and you have to go and find it. And this is a very fun technique. Students generally enjoy it, and it has been shown to be consistently a good way of helping learners to remember new vocabulary. Another technique is this. If you have a dictionary, whether it's a paper dictionary or an electronic dictionary, if you have some way of recording every time you look up a word. Now, on a paper dictionary, you can just take a pen and put a little blue dot or a little black dot next to the word. If you come back to that word and you come back to a word that's got a blue dot and you put another blue dot the next time you look it up, you can be sure that if that word gets 2 or 3 dots, you should make a special effort to learn it. Words which only get 1 dot in your dictionary, probably forget them. You'll never meet them again. But if you keep coming back to the same word in a dictionary 2 or 3 or 4 times, absolutely guaranteed that those are the words you should focus on. And if you're a busy business person, you have limited time, it's very helpful to know which are the words which keep coming back and which you need to practice and really focus on. The last part of my answer is, of course, that for any learner to learn a word thoroughly, completely, profoundly, you probably need to meet the word at least half a dozen, 6 or 7 times. One exposure is never enough, never.
And so that the thing of putting a dot by the word is not only marking out the words that are recurring sufficiently frequently for you to learn them, but also the ones that, if you're going back to them, you clearly haven't picked them up the first time, and so they're more difficult.
Yes, that's a very good point. Yes, so it serves a double purpose.
Yeah.
It's a little technique I learned from a colleague years ago, and it works. It's helped me with the other languages that I've tried to learn in my life.
Okay, thanks. So a question now from Martin Sams, who wonders whether a corpus will be developed that will emphasize context, and particularly looking at tying in with what you were talking about earlier about words that are used across different groups, as nouns, verbs, etc., because that would be very useful for word formation exercises.
Well, in the work that I do with the Cambridge International Corpus, the software which we use online to analyze the corpus when we're writing materials and textbooks for Cambridge, that software is very good at establishing context. So, for example, if I'm writing vocabulary materials for my English vocabulary in use titles, I go online and I analyze the corpus using software, the Cambridge International Corpus, and I can get what are called word profiles. And the computer finds for me all the kinds of contexts in which that word is used, the types of, so if it's a noun, it'll tell me the types of objects it has when it is the subject of a verb, or if it's the object, it will tell me what types of subjects are normally associated with that verb. And it gives me a whole huge amount of information which the computer finds when it looks at all the examples of that word. And the computer can then say, these are the most frequent contexts in which the word is used. Now, that's quite sophisticated software and not available to just, download or for everybody. But what I can say is that the corpus-based materials that Cambridge publishes are already using that kind of information. Yeah. We hope that we are giving you very reliable information on context. It's not just something that we get out of our heads. It's something that is based on contextual analysis of the corpus. Ideally, of course, it would be available to all teachers. You could just go online and just analyze the corpus. But do try the English vocabulary profile, because the example sentences in the English vocabulary profile are actually the most typical contexts in which the vocabulary occurs. They're not strange or weird contexts. They're the most common contexts in which the words have occurred in the Cambridge examinations. So the English vocabulary profile itself is very context sensitive from the point of view of its corpus being what learners have used in their exam tasks and their essays and so on.
Yeah, thanks. So we had a question from Jade Björn about accessing the corpus, because obviously we talked quite a lot about the corpus at different points, and about how individuals can access the corpus. Is the English vocabulary profile the best way to get the useful information from the corpus?
I think so. I mean, you cannot access the Cambridge corpus directly because Well, for various reasons. Firstly, because it is a commercial resource, which Cambridge invested huge sums of money in. Secondly, there are copyright problems that the texts and conversations in the corpus, Cambridge had to get special permission to use them as a database, and it's very difficult to just release that to the public. Now, having said that, of course, there are plenty of other corpora online which you can access. So if you're interested in British English, you can access the British National Corpus, and you can search online in that. If you're interested in American English, you can access what's called the COCA corpus, C-O-C-A, Corpus of Contemporary American. If you're interested in academic language, the language used in universities, you can access the MyCase corpora, M-I-C-A-S-E, which means Michigan Corpus of Academic Spoken English, and that's, as the name suggests, it's university English, but spoken English. So go online and you will find that a number of corpora exist, which you can access. The software is often different. Some are better than others. But in the case of Cambridge, your best access to the corpus is through the English vocabulary profile and soon the English grammar profile. And the fact that Cambridge materials are written by authors who work with the corpus, authors like myself, we work with the corpus before we write the materials. So our materials are a way of making the corpus easier for you. So you can go straight into the class on Monday morning with something that's based on the corpus. But go online, there are plenty of corpora available, and there will be more and more available as time goes on.
Okay, thanks. I'd just like to finish with one more question, if that's okay, please. From Mapazia Nikki, who asks about the best way of teaching new vocabulary at higher levels, whether you have any particular advice on that, please.
Yeah, I think at the higher levels, you can assume that learners will be able to look at a word and be able to spell it and pronounce it and so on. But probably the most important information at the higher level is what I would call the register information of a word. So not only what does it mean, but questions like, is it formal or informal? Is it more associated with speaking or writing? Is it a rather old-fashioned word or a modern word? Is it a word that's mostly used by young people, or mostly used in newspapers, or mostly used in poetry, or that kind of information, which is register sensitive information? I think it's good at the advanced level for two reasons. Firstly, because it makes your learners aware of how the vocabulary operates, how the vocabulary functions in the language, but also it trains them in good vocabulary learning habits, because no matter how long you spend with your students, no matter how many years you have with them, you will never be able to teach them enough vocabulary. Grammar is different. If you have your students for 6 years in secondary school or 3 years in university, you can cover most of the English grammar. You can cover most of the basic rules. But vocabulary, to be an independent user of English, that is to say, someone who can pick up a newspaper or a novel or go to a website and just read fluently or understand fluently a movie or a television program. To be an independent learner, you need to know something between 6,000 and 10,000 words. Now, after 6 years in secondary school, the most you're going to be able to learn, the absolute most, would be about 5,000 or 6,000 words. So there are another 3,000 or 4,000 words that you will have to teach yourself. without a teacher, without a classroom. To do that, you need to have good awareness and good learning habits. So for the advanced level learner, the biggest favor you can do to an advanced level learner, the best gift you can give them, is to help them to become an independent learner of vocabulary so that they will continue to do it after they've said goodbye to you and left your class.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think that's a really good point to end on. So thank you everyone for attending.